Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 134 of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowles. I've got Joe Mead with me, and tonight we've got a couple of Big Ten headlines to go over between some of the more recent games to how the standings look to where we're going to start, Joe. And this is something that the Field of 68 has been doing throughout the month of January here, and they basically did a job rankings poll. They've done it for a lot of the conferences, and similar to like the AP poll or the preseason poll, each team submitted one ballot, and then they ranked them based on how many points they got for what is the best job in the Big Ten. When you saw this one, what was the first surprise that came to mind?
In terms of the list, I was mainly surprised that Michigan was number one, to be completely honest with you, within the Big Ten. That said, as a Michigan fan, the main reason, Sean, is because, let's face it, ever since the Steve Fisher era, which included the 1989 national title and his, I guess, first actual year as the coach, and then the Fab Five era, you've really only had two coaches be successful, and one who's really very early on, and that was John Beeline and Dusty May. And the one thing you could say about both those guys are they're both phenomenal coaches and they're phenomenal everywhere. I think, Indiana would still be my number one, and I know they've struggled in the modern age, let's call it, like post Bobby Knight. What I can tell you is Tom Crean, who, let's face it, he's had his setbacks at Georgia, and I don't think necessarily he was Mr. Elite at Marquette without the Wade Wade. You had who was the guy in 2002, Sean?
Davis?
Why? Yeah, you had Davis be successful there. I think Indiana to me was probably the number one job, just because that's a place where you don't necessarily have to be a master coach. And even at a place like Michigan, Tommy Amaker, who I think's had a lot of good years at Harvard, had a pretty good run at Seton Hall too. He couldn't even really succeed at Michigan. So Michigan isn't to me like, if we're going to compare this to football, I think LSU football is like the best job in college football because you've had coaches that like an Ed Orgeron, Les Miles, who aren't necessarily the elite of elite coaches from a pure football perspective succeed. And I think Indiana is one of the few jobs that has that aspect.
I think there are a legit. I think the top five all have legit claims at the number one spot. I think an argument can be made for all of them. The argument that's being made for Michigan, Joe, is that they have the resources, the backing, the NIL of a blue blood without the expectations of one. And I think that really resonates with, this society that every single thing that you say is in the news and every single move that you make is scrutinized by the fans. But in the NIL era, we know Michigan is obviously extremely, gifted in that regard. But at the end of the day, it's not football. So if Dusty May, you know, loses to a team at the bottom of the league, I don't think, there's going to be protests outside. But and I think that that's a positive and a negative, right? You're never going to be Michigan football, but at the same time, like you said, Michigan's had like a really good amount of success recently. I mean, let's say in the last 20 years or so. Obviously, you have the national title game. Um,
The
you
two,
have
yeah.
another Big Ten championship, um, and so I think that's what got Michigan across the line is that you have everything to be successful without, the razor thin margins to be. Now, I do think there are two negatives to the Michigan job. One of them is admissions. We
Yep.
saw it with Juwan Howard. It was Terrence Shannon and one other player, Caleb Love.
Shannon, Caleb Love, no Joe Eastern back in the COVID days.
So you can't get absolutely everybody in there. And then I think the other thing, Joe, that you will definitely agree with is that it's probably not the most squeaky clean administration that you'd be reporting
Oh,
to.
absolutely not. It's probably the worst administration to work for between Warren Manuel and, Michigan's recently had three different presidents, three full-time, four if you count interim. Mark Schlissel, who was probably the most anti-sports president I've ever seen in terms of during COVID. Flip that to Santa Ono, who was actually a net positive for athletics. He gets pushed out of there for some political reasons, and I think truly there's some people at Michigan who want to make the school more Ivy than state school. They pushed him out, and this new guy, we'll see, but it, I've heard at Syracuse he didn't view athletics as a high priority. So if you're working against three straight administrations like that, I always have this lingering fear in the back of my mind that Dusty May might take the Kansas, Indiana, or North Carolina job. Having a president like that does not make it very easy. Does not help ease those anxieties.
Now, on the other hand, obviously Dusty May is a new coach for you, Joe. You did get him over Louisville and maybe Kentucky. Louisville for sure offered him. Kentucky, we're not exactly sure. So, and then you kept him when Indiana had a vacancy last year. Now, he's still very young and he could still eventually leave. But I think that, you have three really good things going for you and two things going against you. I think there's like I said, an argument for any of these top five really to be there. And I think, the main point of you have some great resources without, the blue blood expectations, which is why they come up first. Now, second is my team, the Indiana Hoosiers. Pretty close. I mean, you can see the points here 322 for Michigan, 320 for Indiana and Michigan State. Like, these are pretty clearly the consensus three best jobs. Now, Joe, for Indiana, it is very easily the top brand in the Big Ten. I think maybe you can do 1A, 1B with Michigan State, but in terms of brand recognition, fan support, as we saw in the college football playoff this year, Indiana is above the rest. In terms of resources, I think they are, right there up in the top of this conference. I don't know if they'll be getting to BYU numbers or any of the top in the sport, but probably top 15 in the sport in terms of resources. You play at one of the coolest arenas in the country. And then for the negatives, Joe, now you can spend this either way, but you've got a national champion across the parking lot now. A lot of those resources are going to be commandeered by Curt Cignetti. So, and on the other hand, that is going to get more people to the brand and everything. But do you think that that is a negative or a positive for this Indiana basketball job?
I think it's a positive in terms of commanding people to the school and to the brand. I think admissions, Indiana is already a pretty noteworthy school. I think admissions are going to skyrocket, and we'll see that come out next year. But the only negative is just this idea that that can be done, and it's
Yeah.
not like Indiana basketball had non-lofty expectations to begin with. Now that the football team, which went from worst to first, literally did that across your parking lot, that might command some pretty lofty expectations. And then the other part of it, shot, it's still Indiana basketball. I'll never forget the shock I had when Tom Crean in 2017 got fired a year after he won the Big Ten outright. So uh, that kind of shows me that that's a job with crazy stress levels, crazy expectations. And one other negative thing I could say, Shot, is, it used to be when high school recruiting was paramount, that was the place because you could build a wall around your state, go into a Chicago, go into anywhere really in the Midwest who'd want to be a Hoosier. Maybe that brand now that the last time Indiana's been in the Final Four has been like 24 years, and then couple that with the fact that it's more of a portal recruiting job now. Uh, that brings it down slightly in terms of negatives I'm thinking of.
And in terms of like the main negative, I would say is that it does not take much for the fan base to turn on you. Like at the end of the day, Indiana is a team that should make the tournament every single year, like we have been saying through the years of doing this, Joe. They're two out of the last nine tournaments. And they have
Jeez,
gotten
yeah.
to the round of 32 and the round of 64. Now, they had one good team that was the second best team of the Big Ten, but the other team was a bubble team. And we'll see what
Right.
happens this year. It's looking like it's going to go down to the wire again for the turn. Like they're going to be first four out or last four in. Um, I certain people will say that the high expectations is a negative. Some will say it's probably a privilege. to get 15,000 in your arena when you're playing a bye game against a team in the 300s. But I think that the last two coaches that have left, things have really soured, especially with Tom Crean, Joe, like you said, rather quickly. With Woodson, I think there was you know, there were definitely some people in there that wanted him out after a third year, which most certainly would have resulted in Dusty May being the head coach. He gets the fourth year, and then we know what happens after that. They get Darren DeVries, who I think is a very good coach, and we'll talk about his best game as a coach a little bit later. But it's pretty clear that those. I think, Joe, let's say this now to wrap up Indiana. I think if Indiana is good, Indiana is the best job in this conference. That makes sense.
Say it one more time.
If like we do this 2 years from now,
Mhm.
and Darren DeVries has gotten the team to back tournaments, and a top half Big Ten finish and then a top four finish, like Indiana's the best job if there's a little bit of success.
I would agree. And also, if he's not fired for that, because, if DeVries consistently makes the tournament, if it doesn't go to the Sweet 16 ever, in like, let's say 5 to 7 years, he'll be on the hot seat in one of those years.
And the team that is tied for second with them, Joe, is Michigan State, also with 4 first place votes and 320 points. This one is a little bit more nuanced to me because Tom Izzo is Michigan State. And he is nearing the end of his career. It might be 5 more years, it might be 1 more year. And then their financial situation is a little bit murky at the moment. We don't know if he's choosing not to use all the resources or that he's using everything and it's just not that much. On the other hand, it's the second best brand in the league. The Izzone is obviously a great place to play. Obviously Michigan State job is pretty high, but how do you think it lines up, positive and negative?
I think, kind of similar. You say this about Indiana and Michigan. The one big thing is you have competition in your state, right? That's a huge issue. I think the other part for Michigan State that's a challenge is you don't know what that place looks like after Izzo. Now, that's such a BS statement because he's been there for our entire lives. But
A lot
who
of people
really
said that
wants to?
about Duke, and it looks
Yeah,
awfully similar.
yeah. But who wants to be the guy after the guy? It's a really hard job to be in. More people not necessarily fail. More people don't succeed than succeed in that position.
And
Let's call that.
and Joe, when Tom Izzo does retire, I think he's gonna be somebody who like is at every game and is at practice all the time. Like I think he's sort of taken like the Roy Williams approach whenever he calls it quits. Like I don't see him quietly going into the night.
No, I agree, and I think he's too involved in the university, for better or worse, however you want to feel about that, to necessarily. I don't want to say give someone the reins, but to not have his stamp
Yeah.
on the program one way or another. The other real aspect about Michigan State, I think that's a huge advantage, is whether this for Sparta, Ishbia money, Gilbert money doesn't really matter to me. It's a very well-funded university. It has the
Yeah.
potential to be one of the best athletic programs in the Big Ten. Fan interest is extremely high in hockey now that they're good. It's always been high in basketball. I don't think you'll ever, as long as you put a decent product, Michigan State fans are the most unrealistic. I kind of always laugh about this. If Michigan State football won 8 games the last, let's call it post D'Antonio era, that place would be filled every game. So fan interest is not hard to gain there. And frankly, I think the expectations aren't crazy lofty. Like, for example, if you replace Izzo and in 8 years you make 7 tournaments and you go to the Sweet 16 more often than not, no one's gonna really persecute you because Michigan State basketball hasn't been to a Final Four since 2019. So I don't think the expectations is insane there. And I also think the fan interest is so high that unless you put a bad product on the court, which with their resources I would find hard to do consistently, you'll always find yourself in a job and you'll always find yourself in a conversation of relevancy.
Yeah, I think they like fast forward to after if they're like not terrible, I think the Arizona will still be a top 2 arena in the league. Like even if they're like the 11th or 12th best team in the league, like that's going to be a hard place to play no matter what. Now coming in fourth and fifth, Joe, is Illinois and Purdue. I think there are definitely some limitations in both of these jobs, but at the same time, Illinois has in this era put together obviously a pipeline from Europe. Admissions is certainly an advantage at Illinois. Not that it's a bad school at all, but a lot of schools he wouldn't have been able to get all of those Europeans in. In terms of the brand, it's really solid. They've got a great home court advantage at the State Farm Center. I think the location is probably a little bit of a disadvantage compared to the other four teams in the top five. It's obviously very close to Chicago, but like there's nothing else in between there in Chicago. So where do you think this? I think this Illinois job is pretty accurately represented here in fourth.
I think it's a tad overrated. I think it's mainly a compliment to Brad Underwood. Again, I
Yeah,
know the success Bill Self and Bruce Weber had in the mid 2000s at Illinois. But my main issue with Illinois is that, you don't have the national title. I think that's definitely something to consider. It's also the fact that they're not utilizing their brand as much. I think it's more Brad Underwood ball that's getting these European
yeah,
guys
no,
and
it is.
transfers to Illinois, not the brand. The 80s and 90s with Lou Henson when Illinois was elite, particularly the 80s, I should say. They'd get all the Chicago kids. You don't really see that anymore. All the prominent Chicago kids want to go to Duke because of like guys like Jabari Parker, for example. They want to go to other cooler brands. The amount of really good Chicago players Illinois wasn't even in the hunt with over the
Yeah,
years kind of speaks to, maybe that brand's not as cool anymore. And I think the number one way this job could be elevated simply is for them to be in a Final Four, for them to be really nationally relevant. Because, I know a lot of people in this conference respect Illinois. I don't think nationally they're viewed the same way as a Michigan, or even like Michigan, a Michigan State. Teams that have been to the Final Four. It's kind of amazing when you take a step back, Sean. In the last 10 years, only four Big Ten teams have been in the Final Four. Wisconsin, Michigan, Purdue, and Michigan State.
and fifth, Joe, is Purdue. Purdue obviously has a positive of their arena is probably the top three at Mackey. Their tradition in their program is probably the best in the league. And in terms of like cohesion, they've had two coaches for the last 50 years. So you're going to get a pretty long leash if you go there. Obviously, Painter's not going anywhere anytime soon, but I think that is a lot of positive. Like you have a really solid fan base that, like Michigan State, comes out every single game. On the negative side, I think financially they're a little bit behind the top of the league here. Now, Painter has gotten around that by buying low on a lot of really solid players and finding diamonds in the rough and supplementing through the transfer portal rather than building through it. But like at the same time, I do think there is a little bit of a financial disadvantage at Purdue.
I agree. The other aspect I don't love about Purdue is, you know, as much as they've been successful over Indiana over the years, they're still viewed as the inferior brand by a lot of people. Very rarely can they recruit high school talent, like elite high school talent to that school either. The other thing that's really hurting them is just, kind of I don't know, Sean. The one thing I don't love about Purdue is I think Mackey's really cool. It's just there's nothing real unique about them other than that.
Yeah.
Style of play is kind of antiquated, and then they've never really had a guy aside from a Carson Edwards, maybe a Jaden Ivey, just like really pop off lately. So that's one thing. That's one thing maybe to consider. It'd be that like relevant in the NBA too. I think that's one thing Purdue needs. Like, it's more funny. The most prominent athlete I remember in our lifetime from Purdue is Drew Brees in the NFL. Haven't really had one for basketball yet.
Yeah, I think maybe with Edie it's a little bit different now, but the great Purdue players have not been like great NBA players.
Right.
Whether you go back to like Etuan Moore and Juwan Johnson and Robbie Hummel, some of them had like respectable NBA careers, but um, like nobody really hit it big. I mean, Edie is probably like the best player, Purdue NBA player for a while. Like he's a solid player. He's not going to be a Hall of Famer, but he was close to winning Rookie of the Year, or maybe he won it. But yeah, I think there are a few limitations with Purdue, even in the even in their best stretch of probably their history here, Joe. They've still, you know, not gotten that banner that they have wanted for so long, and like they lost to Indiana yesterday. They're 3-4 over Indiana over the last 4 years, and Indiana's been a middle of the pack team at best from them. So I think there was an opportunity here to kind of take control of the state, and I don't think they did. Now there's still a lot of time left to go in this season, but I think those are the five best jobs in the Big Ten, Joe. And we do have some other stuff that we want to get to in this episode, so we're not going to go through every single one. But was there another one on here that surprised you where it was located?
Yeah, I thought Maryland, I know what they've been lately, and I know the end of the Turgeon era was what it was, but I think them at number 10 is extremely low. I'd put them closer to the top five than toward,
Okay.
that 10-11 range
I'm surprised it was
because,
that high. I don't think their
well,
facility, Kevin Willard certainly fussed about their facilities quite a bit, but that could have just be him.
I just think the support and the history, the uniforms are a huge advantage. That's just untapped potential at Maryland. I think as an athletic department, it's one of the most untapped athletic departments around the country in terms of football. And then you look at the talent in that area that they've gotten, Derek Queen, the most recent that they've acquired. If you recruited the DMV and you were Maryland, the entire DMV, let's just say they got the two best players each cycle, or two of the three best players each cycle from the DMV. Would be shocked if they weren't in at least one Final Four over the
And
last 15 years.
it's at in a period of time, Joe, where their main rival in the DMV, Georgetown, has really been down.
Has
So
been horrific.
yeah,
So the fact that they haven't taken advantage of that is pretty shocking. Also the fact that they held on to, like, I think Mark Turgeon was one of the best regular season coaches. The fact they couldn't parlay that to any tangible March success is a shame. And then, you know, the Kevin Willard thing, I know that puts a damper on my argument to a lot of people,
he did a
but
decent job though.
no, but I really believe with the right administration in place, I think the brand's powerful enough. I think the location's great, and I really think um if they get it sorted out there, that could be a top five job in the Big Ten.
I was a little bit surprised, Joe, that Ohio State was as high as seventh. Um, they've had like a lot of success recently. Um,
Yeah, Thad
even
Matta era,
even under
absolutely.
Chris Holtman and Thad Matta. But at the same time, like Michigan, it will never be a basketball school, and I don't think I think they might have one of the worst home courts in the conference.
Yep.
Um, Whatever it's called now, it's not
Value
Value
City
City,
Arena.
or it is Value City.
Yeah.
But yeah, like
Or
they've had
Schottenstein Center, rather.
yeah they've had big games where they haven't sold out, and like they've had a couple of okay teams. Obviously, the D'Angelo Russell team that went to the Final Four was. Oh, can you hear me? Sorry, the mic
Yeah.
disconnected. All right, so they've had they went to the Final Four. They've had success, but like the expectations aren't great there. Maybe that's why it got raised up, sort of like Michigan. You can go there, stay under the radar, and you know make the tournament half the years and be pretty successful. But I was a little bit surprised to see that high. I would, if I had to rank them, I would probably rank them in the bottom half.
Yeah. One last thing, Sean, too, is I think the bottom
Yeah, the
I
bottom
are
four,
unanimous.
the bottom
Yeah.
four are unanimous. Whether you want to fourth to last, first to last, yeah, there's a
The
big
only thing I can give
jump after
Northwestern are
Minnesota.
the facilities, but yeah, one of the worst home court advantages. And then Penn State, I just will tell you that athletic department, based on all their actions, does not care. I don't care that Pat Kraft was at a few of the games, rah rahing like he was on that videotape a while back. Uh, because he's probably the loudest person in the arena. Like that is a program that lacks financing, lacks any type of passion for the fan base. And, you could say Mike Rhodes is this or that. I argue you put a Dan Hurley there, and I don't think he'd succeed necessarily.
I mean, they have had a few successful years recently. They had that one good year under Pat
Micah Shrewsbury,
Chambers,
yeah.
and then the Mike Shrewsbury year. But it does say something that he left immediately as soon as they were
Yeah.
good to a job that many considered to be lateral at the time and still is, I would say, Notre Dame. But yeah,
Yeah.
Rutgers is obviously a job that is on the bottom. I was just there last week, and the report comes out that they're tremendously in debt. Like as much as they're trying, Joe, they're like they've had a couple of solid teams in there when you had some you know roster retention and you got some seniors and you got some tough guys in there, but you know in this day and age, like they weren't able to hold over some of their role players before they got those two great recruits, and then the last 2 years have been pretty not great, and then Northwestern and Minnesota too. I think the middle of the pack is very close. It might just depend on the relationship between the football team and the basketball team here as we get into rev share and how much each team is going to get from that. But yeah, this was something that was pretty cool, and obviously almost gave us a half an hour of talking points, and we probably could have gone for another half an hour. But we do want to
Yeah.
get to some games, Joe. But this is cool. If you haven't seen it, they've done it for most of the conferences, and most of them have not been this close. Usually, it's been pretty consensus. 2/3 of the first place votes are on one team, and then of course, I'm interested to see the MAC when it comes out, just because of watching that league for so many years. But that was something cool that the Field of 68 did, and we figured we'd talk about it. But all right, Joe. We had some games this weekend. Mike and I did talk about some of them, so we're not going to regurgitate that conversation. But we had three pretty big games last night, Joe, on Tuesday, and it included a couple of close. All of them were close. But the first game was at the Jersey Mike's Arena in New Jersey. Rutgers leads from minute 1 to minute 39:40, but Ogachukwu hits a big three to force it to overtime, and then Michigan State win in overtime. Uh, what a what a close call for Michigan State. I mean, they were probably outplayed in this one, but they get themselves across the line.
Yeah, and in a game where they really weren't hitting three pointers at the similar clip, without Ugachukwu, they're like five of like 20 from three. And Jackson Kohler, I don't think he played his best game. Luckily, they were saved by Jeremy Fears. I've seen a lot of the point god memes going around. Hard to argue with that yesterday. The one thing that worries me about Michigan State is if they don't like take care of the ball, we saw what happened at Nebraska. Like they're due for not a terrible loss. Like they're never going to get blown out, like we said, but they're susceptible to a lot of teams with better offense taking advantage of them. Now, luckily, in their performances against some of the better offenses, the Indianas, and I know even that game was close for a bit until they went on that crazy run. You know, this is a trend which might pop up again in a game against an elite team. It did against Nebraska. They're gonna really have to mitigate that. It's kind of funny how non-confident both Michigan and Michigan State fans are going into this matchup Friday because of the recent performances. It's hard to not take notice of that, for Michigan State. As much as their in-state rival struggles with keeping the ball, Michigan State does as well, and I think that's something that's really going to have to be taken care of. The one reason Michigan State will always win games is they win the margins. They get more rebounds. And frankly, you look at this free throw percentage, 24 26, 16 to 17 for the line is Jeremy Fears. They win the margins, and that's what's going to allow them to have one of their worst performances of the year and still come out victorious on the road, which, I'm going to give them a lot more credit for than maybe some of their fans will.
Yeah, like they were down and out of this one. I think it got to 15 in the second half, and it just seemed like if you can run sharp half court offense and keep Michigan State out of transition, you're going to have a chance to win. Indiana saw it for 3 quarters of the game. Rutgers saw it for 99% of this game. If you don't let them in transition, like Michigan State's half court offense can be poor. It certainly was here until Jeremy Fierce took over, and he quickly realized that they could not stay in front of him, and he just took it to the hoop every time. He missed a few, he got fouled a bunch, he made a bunch. He was like a running back when the way he would carry the ball into the paint and then flip it up. Like he took the game. He said, This game's going to be on my shoulders." And yeah, obviously he gets to his career high 29, but uh, yeah, enough of this other players missing threes. He was like, "I'm going to either dump it off to Carson Cooper if they crash on me, or just lay it up myself." So I was impressed with him. He was the only one really that I think showed the necessary sense of urgency. Um, like there were some really bad turnovers too, Joe. It's not you can live with some turnovers. If you're pushing it in transition, you're trying to hit an open man, but they would just have like some simple post up, dribble it off foot out of bounds. Like Rutgers didn't do anything to earn that turnover. So they do get out of there with a victory, though. Rutgers has now taken 4 teams to overtime at home, and they've won the previous 3 games in overtime. They won the previous 2. So despite Rutgers being at the bottom of this league, it can still be tough to go in there. But Michigan State gets the job done. All right, Joe, it was a big day for Peacock in the Big Ten. And if you watched it on the app, you certainly have some thoughts about that. Luckily, YouTube TV has NBC Sports Network, so I didn't have to watch it on the app. But you were the first game of this doubleheader. Number 3, Michigan hosted undefeated Nebraska. Nebraska was without Frager and Mast, who was sick. They said he was going to play, and then he just didn't. Nebraska leads from minute 1 to minute 35, but Michigan gets across the line, Joe, and you hand Nebraska their first loss of the year. What were your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think this was just Michigan finding to win away ugly, and I know Nebraska did not have Rick Mast or Frager for like the entire game, so I think Nebraska fans have every right to wonder what could have happened had those guys played. I argue that the 5-out lineup for Nebraska really helped them.
Yeah.
Michigan, was not good at defending the switches. Price Sanford, quickest release in the league. Clearly, it's always been that way. Sam Hoiberg kind of bullied Elliot Cadeau. And one thing Nebraska's probably kicking themselves over. I know we're going to talk about some calls, but I think that stretch where Michigan only scored one field goal at 8 minutes in the second half, because the first half defense was non-existent for both teams, 50 to 48 at halftime. But for Michigan to score one field goal in 6 minutes, if you would have told anyone watching that game in the second half, oh, that's how it's going to start, you would have thought Nebraska got right back out to that 11-point lead that they had in the first half. Uh, they totally slowed down. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact they were mainly playing 6 guys. Uh, their legs got tired, they got in foul trouble, and you kind of saw defensively they were worn down. Not that they quit at all, but they just literally had no more energy toward the end, and that's when you saw Michigan take it to the hole. You saw Perez Johnson get some easy buckets. You saw Yaxel Lendenberg bully his way in there. And then you saw some of the offensive rebounds start to go toward Michigan. I think Nebraska overall, only losing that battle by 2, 9-7 is not bad. But I think toward the end, Michigan got all the critical rebounds they needed, and uh, that's why Michigan ultimately ends up winning. I know, Nebraska fans complain about the calls, and some other fans had some thoughts. I just think that's the nature of how it's going to go. I do believe that had that this been at the bank, this game would not have been close in favor of Nebraska. And the other thing is Nebraska's shooting kind of came back down to earth in the second half. I still think they're a really good team. I think losing on the road to Michigan, down 2 of your best players only by 3, is a really good sign. And frankly, 39 and 40 minutes. If it was 39 minutes, Nebraska, you might be talking about as the number 2 team of the country.
They I think, Joe, that me included, people didn't think that they would be able to continue to sort of eke out these wins against better teams because they had a couple of close games against some bad teams, and they just did. And like I think they intentionally did slow the pace a little bit in the second half because they, like you said, they did not have the bodies today. They are not a deep team anyway. They give some Curtis, a freshman off the bench who's not really a part of the rotation. He plays a part, but yeah, they just didn't quite have the legs to get across the line here. But I do think that they might be the best team in the Big Ten still. Mast and Frager are going to be back for their next game, I believe. Like, they made the number one KenPom team turn the ball over a lot and miss a ton of shots, and they had a chance to win the game. I think that Nebraska is just going to continue to be able to do this. They're going to beat the bad teams, and they're going to be right in the game with the good teams, and they're probably going to win enough of them to stay certainly in the top 4 protected seeds, but maybe even the top 2. Because they already have a good resume. They already have the road win at Illinois. They already have the win against Michigan State. Like, they're building the resume, and I think they just might need to, like, fast forward the month of February. Like, we don't need to learn much about them. Let's get those guys back healthy and see where we can go from there. And then on the Michigan side, Joe, I do think they just found a way. They did the thing where they turned it over a lot and missed a lot of shots. And that version of Michigan, the bad version, is still probably a top 20 team in the country, but it's not the best. But they found a way. They weren't making threes. I think it did play into their hands late that they just sort of didn't have a choice and had to go straight to the basket. They got a lot of free throws. They made a lot of easy layups. And they get the job done. But you're 19-1. They're 20-1. It's going to be a good second half of the Big Ten here to see who can be the champion. All right, Joe. Well, the final game of the day was Purdue going to Assembly Hall to face Indiana. The football team was honored before the game. Curt Cignetti was in attendance, and it's the Hoosiers that get the win that they so desperately needed, 72-67. It was all Indiana early, 11-point lead at the half. They stretch it to 16 in the second half, and they find a way to get across the line despite a late charge from Purdue. Joe, what were your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, really the emergence of Nick Dorn. I think, the last 3 games he's really played well, starting with that game at Michigan. Uh, Maybe this is a consistent pattern for the Hoosiers. Maybe they found another guy to contribute. I don't, everyone thought this could be the Tugger DeVries or the Lamar Wilkerson show, but it was anything but. I know Lamar had, one more point than Nick Dorn, but if he really emerges, Indiana could be not a state per se NCAA tournament team, but more like a protected, not protected, more like a not in Dayton type team. I still think
Or
they're going to float around that 10,
yeah,
11 line.
going to the Big Ten tournament without your life on the line.
Yeah, exactly. And, Hoosier fans are all too familiar with lately with going to the Big Ten tournament with your life on the line, where that was the first effective week of March Madness. So hopefully they can get that going. I'm gonna let Sean really talk about this game since he is the Hoosier expert. But this came at a perfect time. You have that there's 2 tough games out west between UCLA and USC. You have a home game to Wisconsin. Kind of opportunities were slowly running out to
Yeah.
me. You look at that February slate, a lot of home games against teams that are not necessarily in the top 30, the road trips to Illinois and Purdue. I really felt like this was a must-win game for Indiana more so than other people, and they treated it that way.
Yeah, the tournament, the path to the tournament is a lot more open now. It would have been very tough for them to, because this was their first quad one win of the year, Joe, and they only have one quad two. Now, some of those easier home games are quad two, and you absolutely have to win those. But they needed this one. It was probably their best chance for a big home win because they only have Michigan State there, and then Illinois and Purdue on the road. But now they go to this California trip where 1 out of 2, if they can get one of them, they're going to be 15-8 with 2 quad one wins, which is going to be a pretty good spot to be. But this one, I think, Joe, is more about Purdue. They came in on a 2-game losing streak, and they just got totally outplayed by Indiana. This is not something that we have seen from the Hoosiers yet this year. I thought Indiana's defensive game plan was really strong. Offensively, like this wasn't even close to a perfect game. I think we could have said, "Oh yeah, Indiana could win this game." You know, Wilkerson probably has to go for 25 and Tucker has got to be 18 and you know, they've got to make 15 threes and they could have scored more points. Like Wilkerson was 2 of 9 from 3. He could have had a better game. Tucker DeVries only had 9 points and missed 2 front ends of 1-on-1s at the end. Like I think offensively this was a average performance from Indiana, and defensively they brought it enough to get the win. But Purdue, I think there are a lot of things that we can go over here, Joe, between not being able to physically impose themselves on Indiana to what actually their best lineup is, to Fletcher Loyer when he's missing shots, he's not providing much. But how would you diagnose the Purdue problem?
Well, I think it also started on last week at the UCLA game and even the Illinois game. I think defensively, they're content letting the same guy kill them. And look at Keaton Wagner's stat, like 46 points. And I know I don't want to discredit anything Illinois or Keaton Wagner did. How the heck does that even get to that point? Three after three, floater after floater. It's kind of the same thing, and I just don't think they make adjustments. I'm not saying they're not trying to. Whatever the heck they're doing on defense does not work. I know Indiana had an average performance, but it didn't matter because
They could have had more though.
Purdue's
Yeah.
defense has been so bad the last 3 games that and truthfully, the last 4 games, the USC game too, they'll have lapses where they'll get outscored like 10-0. That's not how you're going to win the Big Ten. I think that's out of the question now. Right now, if I'm Purdue, I'm more worried that they don't repeat last year. They go on this little bump stretch where, if you recall last year, they were the Big Ten favorites to mid-February, and then all of a sudden, like loss after loss, and then they're a 6 seed in the Big Ten tournament. I don't think for NCAA tournament seeding it's going to matter too much right now. But if they keep this up, that schedule doesn't necessarily get any easier.
The
You look
next
at
the
it.
next couple are easy, but then they go on 2 tough road trips.
Yeah, but I'll put it to you this way: they cannot afford to lose, Maryland or Oregon, because then you got Nebraska, Purdue, Michigan rematch for the team you lost to, Michigan State. Like that thing gets intense really quickly. So hopefully Purdue with these somewhat bye games can figure it out. And I caution them to not take Sunday lightly at Maryland at all.
And in terms of Braden Smith, Joe, he did have his best game at Assembly Hall in his career. Now, that wasn't saying much because it's the first time that he's gotten to double digits, but he had a ton of big shots in the second half that sort of dragged them back into it. But he was still 5 of 14 from the field for 14 points. Like, Connor Enright played every single second of this one with Tate and Connerway out. And, like, at the minimum, I think he played Braden Smith to a draw, which is a crazy thing to say. And then in terms of Purdue's defense, like you said, Joe, I mean, the amount of total and utter breakdowns on simple actions that Indiana was running was really alarming. I think the TKR situation is something that we could hit on. Like, offensively, he is obviously very clearly better when he's at the 5. And defensively, he cannot play the 5. And even at times today, when you have like a mobile 4 who can shoot, he was running all over the place. Like, he is a great player, but there are some issues with how he fits into this system.
And I had
Still,
a lot of issue with Purdue number one all year. I think the overall roster, it's like when you throw a bunch of pieces, like overall, all the talents there. I
yeah.
just think the mixture of it's really not paid off quite yet. Um, and let's face it, Sean, all 4 of their losses, save UCLA, they just like you see it coming. You really
Yeah.
do.
And I think there were some okay excuses in these last two. Like, look, they controlled most of the game against UCLA. Just a really tough guard made some shots late in Donovan Dent. Okay, you lost a road quad 1 game. Illinois, okay, some player had the best game of his career and you still lost by single digits. there weren't really many excuses here. I
No.
think Indiana is capable of a better performance than this. Like I think it was certainly a solid performance, especially defensively, but like they could have scored more points here. So obviously they get across the line. Wilkerson ends up with 19, Doran with 18, and but with no Tate and Conroy, I think this was an even more special victory for Indiana. Conaway's been sort of off and on injured recently. He's been able to provide some minutes here and there, but he wasn't yesterday. If he was able to give anything, he would have. And ultimately, he didn't. Hopefully, he can be back for the UCLA game. But Indiana's season has some life to it now, and Purdue, at the end of the day, still they're 17-4 and 7-3. Still a good spot to be, but you do see it in the Big Ten, Joe, when one coach finds out something about how to score or what works against a team, chances are the next coach that you see is going to try that too. And Purdue really didn't get any semblance of a rhythm until they went straight pick and roll in the middle of the court with TKR at the 5. And Braden had to make some ridiculous passes to pull some of those shots off. But yeah, I think Purdue, we do have to monitor Purdue. Hopefully, for their sake, they can start playing. Hopefully, for Indiana's sake, they can play a little better too, because this is the crown jewel of their resume right now. And Purdue is still top 10 in the net, so this is a quad 1A game. And hopefully for Purdue too, because preseason number 1, bringing back all those players, Joe, the expectations were obviously pretty high. Those were the 3 main games yesterday. Let's end off this episode, Joe, with a preview of the big game on Friday. Number 3, Michigan heads to the Breslin Center to face number 7, Michigan State. 8 o'clock Eastern on Fox. Michigan's slight favorites right now as the underdog. This one might decide who can challenge Nebraska for this Big Ten championship.
Yeah, and also you throw Illinois in there. I think there's a kind of a top 4 that is now just completely formed now that Purdue's kind of messed up too many times. Yeah, Sean, this is an intriguing matchup for so many different reasons. Dusty May, I know he's only year 2, but yet to get the Tom Izzo monkey off his back. This is a game where I see either team winning, truly, because there's a scenario where Michigan turns it over a lot and plays right into Michigan State's hands. They dribble into bad situations.
Transition,
Cadell,
yeah.
Kaysen, Namari, Michigan State hammers them, gets the ball, Cohen Carr dunk. I've seen that in a lot of situations. There's also a situation where MSU's a little too aggressive, tried to deny Michigan's really good 2-point offense and allows Michigan to get hot from 3. Now, that's not happened the last 2 games. Michigan's 23% from 3 against both Ohio State and Nebraska, their last 2 games. But you do figure Michigan's eventually going to find their stroke. Is it going to be Friday? And then the other aspect of this game that's really underrated is the lineup matchup between May and Izzo. Both teams are really deep. Both teams can play 9 guys. Uh, is Michigan State going to shorten their lineup? I don't think they can really afford not having Kohler on the
Yeah, this
floor
this
for
isn't the time
large
to do that.
portions. And this is not the game to put Wojcik in the game, unless Spears gets in foul trouble
He
or gets a
will.
little banged up. Uh, this is not the game for Jeremy Fears to play less than 32 to 35 minutes.
Yeah, that is something that is probably in terms of like the game plan for the coaches, Joe. That's probably something that they're going to try and figure out on the fly. Like you can always have a plan. Okay, we're going to get him 24 minutes, but it's very matchup based. I think, yeah, like you said, we need a lot of Michigan State needs a lot of Jackson Kohler at the 4 here. I don't think they can go small with Scott or Carr at the 4. Although on the other hand, some teams have caused Michigan some problems by going small. So I think Michigan State might try and sell out for a lot of steals. Like I don't know. I think they might concede that the fact that Michigan's really good at 2-point field goals and try and cause a bunch of turnovers and get in transition because that is their best offense. It always has been, for the past 20 years. Obviously, this is a big game at the Izzone. In terms of the Big Ten standings, Joe, I'm just going to pull them up here. We have a lot of teams have reached the halfway point, so I think it is time to start thinking about some Big Ten tournament seedings. This year, everybody is in the tournament it's just more games on Tuesday. So if we've talked about getting out of Wednesday teams, there are going to be some teams that now have to try and get out of Tuesday games. But Joe, I do think the teams playing on Tuesday, there's 5 teams that are going to be playing that could be playing on Tuesday. And on the other hand, I think we already have our teams that have gotten the double bye.
Right.
So at the other hand, the middle of the pack just becomes a matchup, nightmare that'll probably change multiple times even on the last day.
1,000%. The other thing you consider here too, Sean, is you look at Illinois and Nebraska this weekend too. That rematch is another like this is a huge weekend for the top four. I think the winner of each game, you know, winner of each is kind of competing for that Big Ten title. Not that a loss is going to put Michigan, Michigan State, Illinois, or Nebraska out of this thing, but it's going to be climbing up. And then the psychological factor too. If Illinois loses twice to Nebraska, or they could finally get them back at the bank. You could argue, Sean, if Illinois beats Nebraska, are they the hottest team in the country? I think they would be. Would get Mackey
Yeah, that would be
probably beating
10 wins in a
Washington.
row
10 wins in a row. I mean,
with
it'd
the
be hard to
with
say
the
you're not.
yeah, with the real possibility that it becomes more than that.
Yeah, like, I don't know. And then conversely, this Michigan State game, you know, th-
This is the first
man,
of
this is
two,
a
right, Joe? Or
yeah,
there's
first and
another
two.
one?
This is a monster game, and we'll give predictions here in a second. But I think the three biggest keys to me, Sean, turnovers one, two, can either team like buy a three? I think threes are not going to necessarily rate easily in this game. And then probably the third key is matchups. Can you get your proper guys in on the floor for the proper amount of time and keep them out of foul trouble? I think that's the biggest aspect.
And in terms of Nebraska, Illinois, like you said, Nebraska already won at Illinois, but other than that, everybody's played each other once. So Michigan has beaten Nebraska, Nebraska's beaten Michigan State, and Illinois.
Illinois hasn't played Michigan or Michigan State yet.
Illinois has not played the Michigan schools yet, so I believe you only play them once too. So
Yep,
that, yeah,
both play
obviously
Illinois once.
only three opponents you see twice. It's obviously your protected rival and one other or two other teams other than your protected rival, and it really comes down to luck mostly. Like Indiana has Michigan State and Purdue, and Minnesota is their three opponents that they played twice. That might be a little bit easier to get some tiebreakers. Obviously head to head, if you only play once, you only have one winner. But yeah, I think we pretty clearly have our 3 tiers, maybe even 4 tiers here. Games play when you're going to get to the Big Ten tournament. You playing on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday? I think we might already know that for the most part. But we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.